Opening in the darkness of September 18, 1931, a small explosion along a railway line in northeastern China would ignite a conflict that would reshape the entire Pacific region and set the stage for the most devastating war in human history. But this wasn't an accident. It wasn't the work of Chinese revolutionaries. This was a calculated deception, a false flag operation that would become known as the Mukden Incident, arguably one of the most consequential lies in modern history. The setting: a region on the brink. To understand the magnitude of what happened on that September night, we must first understand the world that made it possible. The year 1931 was a time of global upheaval. The Great Depression had devastated economies worldwide. Democracy trembled under the weight of extremism. And in the vast northeastern region of China known as Manchuria, three great powers vied for dominance in a land that would determine the fate of millions. Manchuria was a land of contradictions, rich in resources yet divided by internal strife, vast in size yet strategically small, ancient in culture yet caught in the crossfire of modern ambitions. To the south, the Republic of China struggled to maintain control over this vast territory. To the east, Japan had already established a foothold in the region. To the north, the Soviet Union watched nervously as tensions simmered. But the real story wasn't about nations or empires. It was about a group of radical Japanese military officers who believed that their country's future depended on control of Manchuria. And they were willing to lie, cheat, and kill to get it. The stage was set for one of history's most audacious military deceptions. And at the center of it all was a man who would later be called the Young Marshal, Zhang Shuiliang. The Young Marshal. Zhang Shuiliang was 27 years old in 1931, but he already carried the weight of an entire region on his shoulders. Known as the Young Marshal, he had inherited his warlord father's army and his ambitions, but not necessarily his father's cunning. Zhang Shuiliang controlled the northeastern army, 160,000 men armed with modern weapons and aircraft. On paper, his forces outnumbered the Japanese Kwantung army by nearly 3-1. Yet as the autumn of 1931 approached, he faced a crisis of confidence that would prove fatal to Chinese control of Manchuria. 3 years earlier, Zhang had made a momentous decision. Despite his father's assassination by the Japanese, he had chosen to ally with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government, hoping to unify China under central control. But this decision came at a cost. Many of his officers were lukewarm about fighting their Japanese former allies. Others were more interested in lining their own pockets than defending Chinese sovereignty. And still others were already in the pay of Japanese intelligence. By September 1931, Zhang's northeastern army was scattered across Manchuria, poorly coordinated and suffering from low morale. The young marshal had ordered his forces to avoid confrontation with the Japanese, a policy that would soon prove catastrophic. But Zhang didn't realize that his opponents had been planning his downfall for months. The plot. Anatomy of a false flag in. The shadows of the Japanese Kwantung Army headquarters in Port Arthur, a small group of radical officers had been meeting in secret. They believed that Japan needed Manchuria to survive, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were visionaries in their own twisted way. Colonel Seishiro Itagaki, 44 years old and battle-hardened from Japan's colonial campaigns. Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishiwara, 36 and brilliant in the way only fanatics can be. And their mentor, Colonel Kenji Doihara, a master of psychological warfare who had spent years infiltrating Chinese military circles. By May of 1931, these officers had developed a plan so audacious, so calculated, that it would make their nation's leaders tremble if they ever learned the full truth. They would stage an attack on a Japanese railway, then blame it on the Chinese, using the incident as justification to invade Manchuria in self-defense. But this wasn't about territory alone. It was about remaking the entire order of Northeast Asia, and it was about a secret understanding that the great powers of the world had grown too weak and divided to stop them. The target was chosen with surgical precision, a section of the South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, close enough to Chinese forces to make the attack look plausible, but far enough from major population centers to minimize civilian casualties. The site at Lutiao Lake was perfect. It sat exactly 800 meters from the Chinese garrison at Beidaying. Any explosion would force the Chinese to respond, and give the Japanese the excuse they needed. The man chosen to plant the bomb was First Lieutenant Sumori Kawamoto, a member of the 29th Infantry Regiment. He was young, ambitious, and absolutely committed to the cause. On the evening of September 18, 1931, he would become the Dianhuoja, the spark that ignited a continent. As evening fell over Manchuria, the stage was set for one of history's most consequential deceptions. The Night of Deception. September 18, 1931. The autumn air was crisp in Mukden as Lieutenant Kawamoto made his way through the shadows, carrying a small bag of explosives. At precisely 10:20 p.m., he planted the charges near the railway tracks. The explosion was supposed to be dramatic enough to justify military action, but not so extensive that it would require days of repairs. The bomb detonated as planned, damaging a 1.5-meter section of track. A train passing minutes later crossed the damaged area without incident. The damage was minimal, but the psychological impact would be enormous. Within hours, the Japanese Kwantung Army launched its retaliation. They claimed Chinese dissidents had attacked the railway and that they were responding in self-defense. But there was one problem with their story that would later haunt them. Some of the Japanese soldiers had been seen placing the explosives, yet the damage was done. The Mukden Incident had provided the perfect pretext for invasion. What happened next would shock the world. The invasion, when heroes become cowards. The morning of September 19, 1931, saw the full might of the Japanese Kwantung Army unleashed. But this wasn't just about responding to a railway bombing. This was about conquest. In Mukden, the Chinese garrison of 11,000 men found themselves facing an assault by better trained, better equipped Japanese forces. The battle lasted less than 6 hours. Chinese casualties, approximately 500 killed. Japanese casualties, 2 dead, 22 wounded. The asymmetry was staggering, and it told a story that went far beyond military skill. But the most shocking moment came not on the battlefield, but in Zhang Xueliang's headquarters. The young marshal had made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Zhang Xueliang ordered his forces to avoid confrontation. Despite having superior numbers and modern equipment, he chose non-resistance. The reasons were complex: political, military, and deeply personal. Within days, the Japanese had captured Mukden. Within weeks, they had overrun Liaoning province. By winter, they controlled 3/4 of Manchuria. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians fled their homes, becoming refugees in their own country. The speed of the collapse shocked even the Japanese military planners. But Zhang Xueliang's surrender of Mukden was just the beginning of a larger betrayal of Chinese sovereignty that would echo through history. The last stand that never came not. All Chinese commanders shared Zhang Xueliang's cowardice. In the northern provinces of Manchuria, some men chose to fight. General Ma Jianshan, commander of the Heilongjiang forces, refused to surrender. Despite lacking proper equipment and facing overwhelming odds, he launched a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese invaders. Other generals followed: Ding Chao, Li Du. They understood what Zhang Xueliang seemed to have forgotten: that sometimes the most important battles are not about winning, but about refusing to surrender. But their heroism came too late. Without coordinated support from the central government and abandoned by their commander-in-chief, their efforts could only slow, not stop, the Japanese advance. By early 1932, the Japanese had established control over most of Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, which had begun with 30,000 men, now commanded a territory larger than France and Germany combined. But control of territory was only the beginning. The Japanese had something bigger in mind: a complete rewriting of the political order of Northeast Asia. The puppet state, Manchukuo in the Emperor's shadow. By March 1932, the Japanese had created something that would become a masterclass in political deception: the state of Manchukuo. At its head stood a figure who embodied centuries of Asian history and tragedy: Puyi, the last emperor of China. Puyi had been 6 years old when he ascended to the dragon throne. He had been deposed as a teenager and had spent years in exile. Now, at 36, he would become the ruler of a nation that existed only in the minds of its Japanese creators. The ceremony was elaborate, the promises grand. Manchukuo would be a prosperous, peaceful, and independent nation. But underneath the golden rhetoric, every major decision was controlled by Japanese advisors. The Japanese called it autonomy. The Chinese called it treason. History would call it what it was: colonialism masquerading as independence. But the greatest deception wasn't political, it was personal. Puyi truly believed he was reclaiming his imperial destiny. The Japanese let him believe it, even as they used him as a figurehead for their own expansionist ambitions. The truth was stark and simple. Manchukuo was created to serve Japanese interests, not Chinese ones. It was a staging ground for further expansion into mainland Asia. The world watches, diplomacy's death rattle in the marble halls of the League of Nations in Geneva. Diplomats watched the events in Manchuria with growing alarm. China appealed to the League on September 19, 1931, the day after the Mukden Incident. But the League's response would demonstrate that the promises of the post-World War I era were little more than ink on paper. The League dispatched a commission, headed by British diplomat Lord Lytton, to investigate the situation. But by the time the commission arrived in January 1932, the Japanese conquest was a fait accompli. The commission's findings, published in October 1932, were damning. The Mukden Incident had been a Japanese false flag operation. Manchukuo was a puppet state. The invasion violated every principle of international law. Japan's response was swift and decisive. In March 1933, Japanese delegates simply walked out of the League of Nations. They would never return. Meanwhile, in Washington, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Stimson issued what became known as the Stimson Doctrine. The United States, he declared, would not recognize any treaty or agreement that violated China's territorial integrity. But words without action are just noise. Despite the Stimson Doctrine, despite the Lytton Report, despite international condemnation, Japan remained in control of Manchuria. The truth was that the Great Depression had left the world's major powers too weakened to confront Japanese aggression effectively. Economic crisis made military intervention impossible. Political division made consensus impossible. As millions struggled for basic necessities, few nations had the resources or will to enforce international law. The League of Nations had become what it always risked being: an elegant joke played on itself. The Mukden Incident had demonstrated something that would reverberate through the coming decade. The old order was dying, and in its place, something far more dangerous was emerging. The human cost, stories of survival and betrayal, behind the grand strategies and diplomatic maneuvers were real people. Families destroyed, communities scattered, futures stolen. Within months of the Japanese invasion, hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians had been displaced. They fled from cities, from villages, from the only homes they had ever known. Many found shelter in refugee camps, living in tents and linsha shelters. Others sought refuge in the Soviet Union or traveled south to unoccupied Chinese territory. For those who remained under Japanese control, life changed dramatically. Japanese became the language of education. Japanese cultural values were imposed on Chinese children. A new legal system was established, one that favored Japanese citizens and punished Chinese resistance. Many Chinese found themselves reduced to second-class citizens in their own homeland. But the most profound change was psychological. The Mukden Incident had shattered the illusion that international law and diplomacy could protect the weak from the strong. Yet even in the darkest moments, there were those who refused to surrender their dignity. Chinese resistance fighters continued to harass Japanese forces. Secret societies formed to preserve Chinese culture and identity. For their courage, many paid with their lives. Japanese reprisals against resistance were swift and brutal. The message was clear: submission or destruction. But in that laughter lay hope, the knowledge that even in the darkest times, the human spirit endures. The long shadow. Consequences that lasted decades. The Mukden Incident did more than redraw the map of Northeast Asia. It changed the course of world history. Control of Manchuria gave Japan access to the raw materials it desperately needed: coal, iron ore, rare earth metals, and agricultural products. This economic foundation would fuel Japanese expansion throughout the 1930s. The success of the Mukden Incident encouraged other Japanese militarists. If they could get away with conquering Manchuria, what was to stop them from invading the rest of China? The psychological impact was equally important. Japanese military officers who had planned the Mukden Incident were promoted and praised. Their methods, deception, aggression, contempt for international law, became official policy. In China, the Mukden Incident triggered a crisis of leadership. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government faced criticism for its failure to defend Chinese territory. The Communists gained support by positioning themselves as the true defenders of Chinese sovereignty. More broadly, the incident demonstrated that the international system created after World War I was fundamentally broken. The League of Nations proved unable to enforce its own resolutions. The major powers proved unwilling to risk confrontation to defend international law. Perhaps most importantly, the Mukden Incident showed other aggressive nations what was possible. When Japan walked away from the League of Nations with no meaningful consequences, other nations took note. Italy would soon invade Ethiopia. Germany would begin rearming in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Mukden Incident had shown that aggression could succeed if the victims were weak enough and the world was divided enough. The peace that had been supposed to last forever was crumbling, and the Mukden Incident had provided the first brick in the wall of the coming catastrophe. Closing reflections. Lessons from a false. The Mukden Incident ended the dreams of the interwar period, the belief that diplomacy could replace war, that international law could protect the weak, that reason could triumph over aggression. In the end, the story of the Mukden Incident is the story of choices made by individuals that determined the fate of millions. Colonel Itagaki and his co-conspirators chose deception over honor. Zhang Xueliang chose compromise over resistance. The major powers chose comfort over principle. Each choice seemed reasonable at the time. Each choice seemed like the lesser evil. Together, they created a disaster that would consume the world. The invasion of Manchuria did not begin World War II, but it provided the template for what would come next. False flag operations, puppet governments, aggressive expansion, international impotence, all would become features of the coming decades. Today, the city of Mukden, now called Shenyang, stands as a testament to the complexity of history. It is a modern metropolis built on layers of the past, where the ghosts of 1931 still haunt the streets. Every September 18th at 10:00 a.m., air raid sirens sound across the cities of northeastern China. They commemorate not just the Mukden Incident, but the moment when the world chose to look away from aggression. For the survivors and their descendants, the memory of 1931 remains alive. It serves as a reminder that the price of silence is often paid by others. The Mukden Incident was more than a military operation. It was a test of the international community's will to uphold the principles of law and justice, and it was a test that humanity failed. Epilogue. The echoes of 1931, the lessons of the Mukden Incident extend far beyond the borders of Manchuria. They speak to every generation that faces the choice between principle and convenience. Today, as nations face new forms of aggression and deception, the ghost of Colonel Itagaki's bomb still haunts the international system. The choice between action and inaction remains as critical as ever. The last survivors of the Mukden Incident are dying, taking their memories with them. But the historical record remains, waiting for future generations to understand its lessons. Remarkably, Japan and China have moved beyond the legacy of 1931 to become major trading partners and regional powers. The past has not been forgotten, but it has not been allowed to define the future. Yet, as we reflect on the Mukden Incident, we must remember that peace is not inevitable. It must be chosen and defended by each generation. The false dawn of September 18, 1931, brought not just a new day, but a new darkness to the world. The light that followed would take decades to emerge, but emerge it did, because some people, like General Ma Zhanshan and the countless others who refused to surrender, chose to fight for a better future, even when the odds seemed impossible. Their courage and their choice ultimately proved stronger than the deception that began it all. History remembers not just the choices of leaders, but the choices of ordinary people. The Mukden Incident reminds us that when we fail to act in the face of injustice, we become complicit in the crimes that follow.